In 1943, Luftwaffe pilots had developed a simple rule for dealing with the American P-47 Thunderbolt. When you spotted one of these massive fighters lumbering toward you, you climbed. You pulled back on your stick and pointed your nose toward the heavens, because everyone knew that the barrel-shaped American fighter could not follow you there. The Thunderbolt was fast in a dive, certainly, and dangerous at high altitude where its turbo supercharger gave it an edge. But in a climb, the thing handled like a pregnant cow. German pilots joked about it in their ready rooms. They called it names that translated roughly to flying bathtub and iron beast. They had studied the captured examples that German intelligence had acquired, and they understood its weaknesses as well as they understood their own Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. So when a German pilot pulled his Bf 109 into a steep climb over France in early 1944, expecting to leave the pursuing Thunderbolt wallowing helplessly below, he was following established doctrine. This tactic had worked dozens of times before. The American would lose energy, his nose would drop, and the German would have the advantage. Except this time, something was different. The Thunderbolt did not fall away. It stayed with him, its massive radial engine somehow clawing for altitude with an aggression that defied everything German pilots thought they knew. By the time he realized that the rules had changed, 850 caliber machine guns were filling his aircraft with holes. What German intelligence had missed? What Luftwaffe pilots were only now discovering in the most violent way possible was a modification so elegantly simple that it seemed almost stupid. Someone had changed the propeller. This is the story of how a different set of blades transformed one of the most underestimated fighters of the Second World War into a monster that Germany never saw coming. It is a story of immigrant genius and American industrial might, of pilots who refused to give up on their aircraft and engineers who found performance where others saw none. And it is a story of how the Third Reich, convinced of its own technological superiority, was blindsided by a nation they had fundamentally misjudged. The P-47 Thunderbolt began its life as an act of desperation born from genius. Its creator was a Georgian immigrant named Alexander Kartveli, though Americans would come to know him simply as Alexander Kartveli. Born in Tbilisi on September 9, 1896, when Georgia was still part of the Russian Empire, Kartveli came from a noble family in a land with a proud warrior tradition stretching back millennia. He had served as an artillerist in the First World War and was sent home after being wounded in the leg, an experience that would shape his later philosophy of aircraft design. Tough, rugged machines that could bring their pilots home even when damaged became his obsession. After the war, Kartveli made his way to Paris, where he enrolled at the École supérieure d'aéronautique et de construction mécanique, one of the premier aviation engineering institutions in Europe. The French had been pioneers in aviation, and their schools attracted the most ambitious minds in the field. Kartveli graduated in 1922, having absorbed everything they could teach him about aerodynamics, structures, and power plants. By the time he completed his studies, he possessed both the theoretical knowledge and the practical instincts that would define his career. By 1931, Kartveli had arrived in America, drawn by the country's booming aviation industry and its seemingly limitless opportunities. He joined the Seversky Aircraft Corporation as chief engineer, working alongside another immigrant from the Russian Empire, the company's founder Alexander Seversky. The company specialized in advanced fighters, and Kartveli quickly made his mark. He was responsible for the SEV-1XP, which became the P-35, one of the first modern all-metal monoplane fighters adopted by the Army Air Corps. But he had bigger ambitions still. When the Army Air Corps issued requirements for a new high-altitude interceptor in 1940, Kartveli saw his opportunity. The specifications called for an aircraft that could climb quickly to altitude and engage enemy bombers before they could reach their targets. Most designers began sketching relatively conventional fighters powered by liquid-cooled inline engines. Kartveli looked at those designs and dismissed them. He wanted something with overwhelming power, something that would dominate any opponent through sheer brute force. His attention turned to the most powerful aircraft engine in existence, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp. This 18-cylinder, twin-row radial monster displaced 2,804.5 cubic inches and produced 2,000 horsepower. Nothing else in the American arsenal came close, but the R2800 had never been installed in a single-engine fighter. It was simply too big, too heavy, too complex. Most engineers assumed it was unsuitable for anything smaller than a twin-engine aircraft. Kartveli saw things differently. Yes, the R2800 was enormous. Yes, building a fighter around it would require solving engineering challenges that no one had ever attempted. But if those challenges could be overcome, the resulting aircraft would be unlike anything the world had ever seen. It would have power to spare, the ability to climb and dive and fight with authority that lighter fighters could never match. The weight that others saw as a liability, Kartveli viewed as potential energy, momentum that could be converted into devastating attacks. The challenges were indeed staggering. The R2800 was not just powerful, but physically massive, requiring a fuselage that could accommodate both the engine itself and the complex turbo-supercharger system that would allow it to maintain power at high altitude. Unlike conventional superchargers that were geared directly to the engine, the turbo-supercharger used exhaust gases to spin a turbine that compressed incoming air. This system was essential for high-altitude performance, but required elaborate ducting and added significant weight and complexity. The resulting aircraft would be the heaviest single-engine fighter ever built, tipping the scales at over 14,000 pounds fully loaded. The empty weight alone exceeded 10,000 pounds. When Kartveli presented his design, some reportedly thought he had lost his mind. The aircraft was simply too big, too heavy, too ambitious. Kartveli reportedly acknowledged the criticism by remarking that while his creation would indeed be a dinosaur, it would be a dinosaur with good proportions. Whether he actually said those exact words has never been confirmed from primary documents, but the phrase became part of Thunderbolt lore. The prototype, designated XP-47B, took shape at Republic Aviation's factory in Farmingdale, Long Island. The company had been renamed from Seversky Aircraft Corporation on October 13, 1939, after a boardroom reorganization that ousted the flamboyant founder. Kartveli, focused entirely on his work, barely noticed the corporate drama. He was too busy solving the hundreds of engineering problems that his ambitious design had created. On May 6, 1941, test pilot Lowery Brabham lifted the XP-47B off the runway for its first flight. Even with a cracked cylinder head that robbed the engine of several percent of its rated power, the prototype reached 412 miles per hour at nearly 26,000 feet. The performance vindicated Kartveli's vision. Republic Aviation had a winner on its hands, and the Army knew it. By September 13, 1940, even before the first flight, the service had already placed an order for 773 aircraft at a cost of $56.5 million. But the Thunderbolt that entered service in early 1943 was a different beast from the one that would later terrorize the Luftwaffe. The early P-47B and C models, while fast at altitude, suffered from limitations that German pilots quickly learned to exploit. The aircraft's massive weight gave it poor acceleration. Its climb rate was mediocre compared to lighter fighters, and most critically, its performance below 15,000 feet was distinctly unimpressive. The turbo supercharger that gave the Thunderbolt its high-altitude advantage actually became a liability at lower levels, adding weight and complexity without commensurate benefit. Luftwaffe intelligence officers studied captured examples carefully. Their test pilots flew mock combat against the American fighter and developed tactical recommendations based on their findings. The conclusions were reassuring for German pilots. The P-47 was not to be underestimated in its preferred environment of high altitude, but it could be defeated through proper tactics. Engage below 15,000 feet when possible. If attacked from above, turn hard to force an overshoot, then dive away or climb to escape. The American fighter's poor acceleration meant it could not quickly reverse a bad situation. The Germans even acquired a pristine example for detailed evaluation. On November 7, 1943, Second Lieutenant William E. Roach of the 358th Fighter Squadron became disoriented during a mission and accidentally landed at the German-held airfield at Caen-Carpiquet. His P-47D-2RA, serial number 42-22490, had run critically low on fuel due to unexpected 100-mile-per-hour headwinds. The aircraft, which carried the American nickname Beetle as its nose art, fell into German hands intact. The Germans repainted the Thunderbolt in Luftwaffe camouflage and assigned it the markings T9+FK. The captured Thunderbolt was sent to the testing center at Rechlin and later assigned to a specialized unit called Circus Rosarius, commanded by Hauptmann Theodor Rosarius. This unit flew captured Allied aircraft to familiarize German pilots with enemy capabilities. Their evaluations reinforced existing tactical guidance. The P-47 was powerful, but predictable. It could be fought effectively by pilots who understood its limitations. The problem with this assessment was that it was based on an aircraft that was about to become obsolete. The Germans had captured an early variant, tested it thoroughly, and drawn conclusions that would soon become dangerously wrong. They had no way of knowing that American engineers were already working on improvements that would transform the Thunderbolt's performance characteristics. This intelligence failure would cost the Luftwaffe dearly. German technical intelligence was generally excellent during the war. They captured and evaluated numerous Allied aircraft, often learning their secrets within weeks of new types entering combat. But the paddle blade propeller modification fell through the cracks. It was not a new model designation. It was not a new engine variant. It was simply a different propeller. A component that looked superficially similar to the old one and could easily be missed by observers who were not specifically looking for it. By the time German intelligence realized that something had changed, their pilots had already paid the price of discovery. Reports from surviving pilots told of Thunderbolts that no longer behaved as expected, that could climb when they should have wallowed, that could catch fighters attempting to escape. But translating these combat reports into updated tactical guidance took time, and time was something the Luftwaffe no longer had in abundance. The 56th Fighter Group, one of the first units to receive the Thunderbolt in Europe, struggled initially to adapt to their new mounts. The group had arrived in England in January of 1943, entering combat in the most demanding theatre of the air war. Their early encounters with the Luftwaffe were frustrating. German pilots seemed to know exactly how to fight them. They would engage at lower altitudes where the Thunderbolt was sluggish, or they would simply climb away when things got difficult. Victories were possible but hard won. The first confirmed kill by the 56th came on June 12, 1943, when Captain Walter Cook of the 62nd Fighter Squadron shot down a Focke-Wulf 190 over Blankenberg, Belgium. He was flying a P-47C with the serial number 41-6343, decorated with the codes LM-W and named Little Cookie. It was a start, but the learning curve remained steep. The group's commander, Hub Zemke, worked tirelessly to develop tactics that would maximize the Thunderbolt's strengths while minimizing its weaknesses. He drilled his pilots relentlessly, knowing that survival in combat depended on understanding exactly what their aircraft could and could not do. One pilot, who would become synonymous with the Thunderbolt, arrived in England determined to prove that the big fighter could hold its own against anything the Germans could put in the sky. Robert S. Johnson was a young man from Lawton, Oklahoma, with supreme confidence in his abilities and his aircraft. He had trained relentlessly in the States, becoming one of the best pure stick and rudder pilots in his class. Now he wanted to test himself against the Luftwaffe. Johnson's faith in his aircraft would be tested on June 26, 1943, in an encounter that became legendary among Thunderbolt pilots. Flying escort for B-17S returning from a raid on Villa Coublay, Johnson found himself in a swirling dogfight with German interceptors. His P-47 was hit hard, multiple times. His canopy was shattered, his aircraft was on fire, and his controls were barely responding. Fuel and hydraulic fluid sprayed into the cockpit. When Johnson tried to bail out, his damaged canopy refused to open completely. What followed was a 40-minute running battle in which Johnson, wounded and flying a crippled aircraft, was attacked repeatedly by a Focke-Wulf 190. The German pilot made pass after pass, pouring rounds into the Thunderbolt. Johnson could do little but hold his aircraft level and pray. He later recounted that he watched the enemy fighter pull alongside at one point, close enough that he could see the pilot examining his battered aircraft, seemingly amazed that it was still flying. The German shook his head in apparent disbelief. The identity of the German pilot has never been confirmed despite various attributions over the years. The enemy pilot eventually broke off. Perhaps he was out of ammunition. Perhaps he simply could not believe the American fighter would ever reach home and decided to save his remaining rounds for a target that posed more threat. Whatever the reason, Johnson found himself alone over the Channel, nursing his shattered Thunderbolt back toward England. The aircraft was barely controllable. Every movement of the stick required enormous effort. But the big fighter kept flying. When Johnson finally touched down in England and ground crews examined the aircraft, they counted 21 20mm cannon shell impacts and more than 200 hits from 7.92mm machine gun rounds. Johnson had stopped counting bullet holes before he finished because there were simply too many. The plane was immediately written off as a total loss, fit only for salvage. The fact that Johnson was alive at all was a testament to the Thunderbolt's incredible ruggedness, a quality that would become as famous as its firepower. German ace Heinz Baer, who flew against American fighters throughout the war, reportedly observed that the P-47 could absorb an astounding amount of lead and had to be handled very carefully. But absorbing punishment was a defensive virtue. What the Thunderbolt needed was more offensive capability, particularly in the climb where German pilots had learned to escape. The solution came not from a radical redesign, but from an elegantly simple modification to a component that most people never thought about. The original P-47s flew with a Curtiss electric propeller designated C542 S-A6. Its blades were relatively narrow, a design that worked adequately but failed to take full advantage of the enormous power the R2800 could deliver. The propeller simply could not bite enough air to translate all that horsepower into forward thrust, particularly at lower airspeeds and during climbs where the aircraft was most vulnerable. The physics were straightforward. A propeller converts rotational energy from the engine into thrust by accelerating air rearward. The amount of thrust generated depends on how much air the propeller can grab and how efficiently it can accelerate that air. A narrow blade moves through the air with less resistance but also moves less air with each revolution. At high speeds, this is acceptable because the aircraft's forward velocity provides additional airflow, but at low speeds, during takeoffs and climbs, the narrow blade cannot translate engine power into thrust efficiently. Engineers at both Curtiss Electric and Hamilton Standard had been working on a new generation of propellers featuring wider chord blades. These so-called paddle blade propellers could grab more air with each revolution, improving the efficiency of power transfer from engine to thrust. The wider blades created more drag when not under power, but when the R2800 was roaring at full throttle, they could finally harness its tremendous output. The theory was sound. Wind tunnel tests confirmed the expected improvements. The question was whether the gains would translate into meaningful advantages in actual combat, where dozens of variables influenced outcomes, and pilots fought in 3 dimensions at speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour. The answer came in early 1944, when the 56th Fighter Group began receiving Thunderbolts fitted with the new Hamilton Standard 24E 50-65 propeller. The difference was immediately apparent, so obvious that pilots could feel it from their very first takeoff. The aircraft accelerated more quickly. It climbed more steeply. The nose came up without the wallowing sensation that had characterized earlier models. The paddle blade propeller, with its 13-foot 1 and 7/8 inch diameter and dramatically wider blades, gave the Thunderbolt a climb rate improvement of approximately 400 feet per minute. The new climb rate exceeded 2,600 feet per minute, a substantial improvement over earlier variants. That might not sound revolutionary on paper, but in aerial combat, where engagements were decided in seconds and altitude was life, it was the difference between catching your enemy and watching him escape. Robert Johnson received his paddle blade propeller in early January of 1944. He noticed the improvement immediately during his first test flight and could barely contain his excitement. The Thunderbolt he had defended so fiercely, the aircraft that had brought him home when any other fighter would have fallen from the sky, had just become significantly more dangerous. The production variants that incorporated this improvement from the factory began reaching frontline units in the spring of 1944. The P-47 D-22R from Republic's Farmingdale plant received the Hamilton Standard paddle blade propeller, while the P-47 D-23RA from the Evansville factory received the equivalent Curtiss Electric C542SA114. Both variants also incorporated the R280059 engine, which produced approximately 2,300 horsepower with water methanol injection, a significant increase over earlier power plants. For German pilots, the change was catastrophic. Tactics that had worked for nearly a year suddenly became death traps. The standard Luftwaffe escape maneuver against P-47s, the steep climb that had allowed so many German fighters to break contact, now put them in exactly the wrong position. Where before the Thunderbolt would have fallen away, unable to maintain energy in the climb, the paddle blade-equipped aircraft stayed right with them. German pilots who pulled up to escape now found themselves in a slow-speed fight with an opponent whose 850 caliber machine guns could tear their aircraft apart. The psychological impact was profound. Luftwaffe pilots had built their anti-Thunderbolt tactics around exploiting specific weaknesses. They had trained for those tactics, survived because of them, taught younger pilots to rely on them, Suddenly, one of those weaknesses had largely disappeared. German intelligence, which had studied captured P-47s and developed detailed tactical recommendations, was caught flat-footed. Their information was obsolete, and pilots were dying because of it. The timing could not have been worse for the Reich. By early 1944, the Luftwaffe was already stretched thin. The combined bomber offensive was draining fighters away from other fronts to defend the homeland. Experienced pilots, the backbone of any air force, were being killed faster than they could be replaced. Training programs had been curtailed to rush new pilots to operational units, meaning replacements arrived with inadequate skills, and now one of the most common American fighters had received an upgrade that rendered established defensive tactics ineffective. Hub Zemke, who had taken command of the 56th Fighter Group and moulded it into the most successful P-47 unit in the European theatre, developed new tactics to exploit the improved capabilities. His famous Zemke fan technique, first employed on May 12, 1944, used multiple flights of fighters spreading out in a fan pattern to cover more airspace and catch German fighters attempting to escape. During its first use, Zemke's own element was attacked by 7 Bf-109s, led by Major Günther Rall, the Luftwaffe's third-ranking ace with 275 victories. Rall shot down both of Zemke's wingmen, though Zemke himself escaped. He would not learn the identity of his attacker until years after the war. The paddle blade propeller made the Zemke fan even more effective, since Thunderbolts could now pursue climbing targets that would previously have escaped. The 56th Fighter Group's score mounted rapidly. By war's end, the Wolfpack would claim approximately 665 aerial victories, according to Air Force Historical Research Agency records, against just 128 aircraft missing in action. They remained the only 8th Air Force fighter group to fly the Thunderbolt exclusively from the beginning of their combat operations to the end of the war. Zemke himself scored 17 3/4 aerial victories before his luck ran out on October 30th, 1944. By then he had transferred to command the 479th Fighter Group, which was converting from P-38s to P-51 Mustangs. During a mission that day, Zemke encountered severe unforecasted turbulence that caused catastrophic structural failure of his Mustang's wing. He bailed out successfully but was captured after several days of evasion. He spent the remainder of the war at Stalag Luft 1, where he became senior Allied officer and helped maintain morale among approximately 9,000 American prisoners. The transformation of the P-47 came at exactly the right moment in history. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy. The Thunderbolt, now fully optimized as both an air superiority fighter and a ground attack platform, became one of the most important aircraft of the liberation of Europe. Pilots who had trained for aerial combat found themselves increasingly called upon to support ground troops, attacking German armor, vehicles, and fortifications. In the weeks following D-Day, P-47s ranged across France, hunting anything that moved on German-controlled roads. The aircraft's ruggedness, which had saved pilots like Robert Johnson, now proved equally valuable in the ground attack role. Thunderbolts returned from strafing missions with damage that would have destroyed lighter fighters. The massive radial engine that made the P-47 so heavy also protected its pilot from ground fire, acting as a steel barrier against small arms and light flak. A rifle bullet or shell fragment that might kill a pilot in a liquid-cooled fighter would simply bury itself in the R2-800's cylinders. The carnage inflicted by Allied fighter bombers reached staggering proportions. On August 12, 1944, as German forces struggled to respond to the Allied breakout from Normandy, American fighter aircraft across the theatre claimed the destruction or damage of 350 locomotives, more than 3,000 rail cars and transport wagons, 800 road vehicles, and 9 oil barges in a single day. The P-47, with its ability to carry 2,000 pounds of bombs in addition to its 8 machine guns, was at the forefront of this aerial onslaught. German soldiers gave the Thunderbolt nicknames that reflected their terror. Jabberschreck, meaning fighter-bomber fear, became common shorthand for the constant anxiety that gripped German troops whenever skies were clear. The term Jabotod, fighter-bomber death, entered military vocabulary as death at the hands of Allied fighter-bombers became so common that it required its own designation. Officers noted that their soldiers were becoming afraid to move during daylight hours. Vehicles travelled at night whenever possible. Troop movements were timed to coincide with cloudy weather. The psychological effect of constant air attack was degrading German combat effectiveness as surely as the physical destruction. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, one of Germany's most experienced commanders, told American correspondents after his capture that Allied air power was the biggest factor in Germany's defeat in the West. This was not merely a defeated general making excuses. The evidence supported his assessment. German logistics had been shattered. Reinforcements could not reach the front. Units that should have been concentrated for counterattack remained scattered, because moving them invited destruction from the air. The ultimate test of the Thunderbolt's ground attack capability came during the Battle of the Bulge in December of 1944. When German forces launched their surprise offensive through the Ardennes on December 16th, bad weather initially grounded Allied aircraft. German commanders had specifically timed their attack to coincide with a period of predicted overcast, knowing that American air power would devastate their advancing columns if skies were clear. For several days, fog and low clouds protected the German advance. Panzers pushed through American lines, while Thunderbolts and other fighters sat helpless on their bases. But the weather could not last forever. When skies cleared on December 23rd, Allied air power descended on the German salient with devastating effect. The 365th Fighter Group, known as the Hellhawks, was among the units thrown into the fight. On December 17th, before the weather fully closed in, Major John William Motzenbecker, commander of the 387th Fighter Squadron, discovered a massive German column near Monschau. The column stretched bumper to bumper along the narrow Ardennes roads, presenting a target that fighter-bomber pilots dreamed about. The Thunderbolts of the entire group attacked with bombs, rockets, and machine guns. When the smoke cleared, more than 115 German vehicles and artillery pieces had been completely destroyed, with another 65 wrecked or damaged beyond immediate repair. Ground units that later surveyed the destruction confirmed that actual damage exceeded even the pilots' claims. The German offensive, which had initially achieved complete surprise and threatened to split the Allied armies, ultimately foundered in part because of air power. Every clear day brought swarms of Thunderbolts and Mustangs over the battlefield. German tanks that had advanced boldly during the bad weather found themselves hunted from the air. Supply convoys were shot to pieces before they could reach the front lines. The bulge that German forces had created in Allied lines gradually contracted under combined ground and air pressure. This was the role the P-47 had been born to play. Its massive engine gave it the power to carry heavy bomb loads. Its rugged airframe allowed it to absorb ground fire that would have brought down lighter aircraft. Its 8 machine guns could shred soft targets with devastating efficiency. And the paddle blade propeller ensured that when German fighters tried to interfere, the Thunderbolts could fight back effectively. But it was not just the ground attack role where the improved Thunderbolt excelled. In the air superiority mission, the paddle blade P-47 was proving deadlier than ever. Francis Gabreski, born Franciszek Stanisław Gabreski in Oil City, Pennsylvania, to Polish immigrant parents, became the top American ace in Europe flying the Thunderbolt. His parents had arrived from Poland seeking opportunity in America's industrial heartland. Their son would find his opportunity in the skies over occupied Europe. Gabreski had an unusual path to combat. Before America entered the war, he had volunteered to serve with No. 315 Polish Fighter Squadron in the Royal Air Force, flying Spitfires against the Luftwaffe. This experience gave him invaluable combat knowledge that few American pilots possessed when they arrived in England. When he transferred back to the Army Air Force and joined the 56th Fighter Group, he brought lessons learned in the hardest school imaginable. By July of 1944, Gabreski had accumulated 28 aerial victories, making him the highest-scoring American fighter pilot in the European theater at that time. Each victory represented a life-or-death struggle against skilled opponents, flying excellent aircraft. The Luftwaffe of 1944 was weakened but not finished, and German pilots who had survived that long were dangerous adversaries. Gabreski's success was cut short on July 20th, 1944. During a strafing run on parked Heinkel 111 bombers at an airfield near Bassenheim, his propeller clipped the ground. The impact was slight but fatal to the aircraft. Gabreski crash-landed and evaded capture for several days before German troops found him. He spent the remainder of the war as a prisoner, but his legacy with the Thunderbolt was secure and his career was far from over. After the war and his release from captivity, Gabreski remained in the Air Force. When war erupted again in Korea, he returned to combat, this time flying F-86 Sabres against Soviet-built MiG-15S. He added another 6.5 victories to his record, becoming one of only 7 American pilots to achieve ace status in 2 wars. His combined total of 34.5 aerial victories placed him among the highest-scoring American pilots of all time. Robert Johnson, whose survival on June 26th had demonstrated the Thunderbolt's incredible toughness, continued to add to his score throughout 1943 and 44. He finished the war as the second highest-scoring American ace in the European theater with 27 confirmed victories. Like Gabreski, he had proven that the P-47, properly handled, could compete with anything the Luftwaffe could put in the air. Meanwhile, in the Pacific theater, the Thunderbolt was writing its own chapter of history. Colonel Neil Kirby became the leading P-47 ace in the Pacific, ultimately claiming 22 victories against Japanese aircraft. His fighting style was aggressive to the point of recklessness, but it produced results that made him a legend. Kirby's most famous action came on October 11th, 1943, near Wewak, New Guinea. Leading a flight of 4 Thunderbolts, he spotted a formation of approximately 36 Japanese fighters escorting 12 bombers. Any sensible pilot would have reported the sighting and waited for reinforcements. Kirby attacked. In the ensuing battle, Kirby personally shot down 6 enemy aircraft. His wingmen added more to the tally, and the Japanese formation was scattered. The action earned Kirby the Medal of Honor, with the official citation noting his extraordinary heroism and selfless devotion to duty. He had taken on odds of nearly 10-1 and emerged victorious. Kirby's luck ran out on March 5th, 1944. After scoring his 22nd victory near Wewak, he was bounced by Japanese Ki-43 fighters of the 77th Sentai. His Thunderbolt was hit and he bailed out, but he died of his wounds before rescuers could reach him. His remains were not recovered until 1947 and were not positively identified until approximately 1949. He had lived fast, fought hard, and died at the peak of his abilities, a fate shared by too many of the war's finest pilots. The Germans, meanwhile, continued to underestimate American industrial capacity as badly as they had underestimated the Thunderbolt itself. Republic Aviation's factories were producing aircraft at a rate that would have seemed impossible to European manufacturers. At peak production, the Farmingdale plant on Long Island and the Evansville facility in Indiana were turning out dozens of Thunderbolts every single day. The assembly lines never stopped. 3 shifts of workers kept the factories running around the clock. The production numbers tell their own story of American industrial might. A total of 15,683 Thunderbolts were built during the war. The Farmingdale plant produced 9,087 aircraft. Evansville contributed 6,242. Even Curtiss-Wright's Buffalo plant built 354 P-47Gs under license. The factories that had produced automobiles and washing machines before the war had been converted into precision manufacturing facilities capable of building the most advanced fighters in the world. On September 20th, 1944, Republic celebrated the 10,000th Thunderbolt to roll off its assembly lines. The milestone was marked by a ceremony featuring Jacqueline Cochran, director of the Women Air Force Service Pilots, who christened the aircraft 10 grand by smashing champagne across its propeller hub. The Wasps had ferried hundreds of Thunderbolts from factories to operational bases, freeing male pilots for combat duty. Wasp Teresa D. James then flew 10 grand on its first delivery leg. Cochran herself was one of the most accomplished pilots of her generation, and her presence at the ceremony honoured the contributions of women to the air war. The unit cost of the P-47 dropped as production efficiencies improved, falling from early production prices to around $83,000 per aircraft by war's end. Each aircraft was a precisely engineered weapon system that could fly hundreds of combat missions before requiring major overhaul. The later war variants pushed the Thunderbolt's performance even further. The P-47M, powered by the R-28005 7C engine, producing 2,800 horsepower with water methanol injection, could reach 470 miles per hour at 30,000 feet. This was the variant that truly earned the monster designation. Only 130 of these hot rods were built, and they were issued exclusively to the 56th Fighter Group for the specific purpose of intercepting German jet aircraft and V-1 flying bombs. The Wolfpack put their P-47Ms to deadly use. As Germany deployed its revolutionary Me-262 jet fighters and Arado 234 jet bombers, the improved Thunderbolts were often the only piston engine fighters fast enough to catch them. The jets were vulnerable during takeoff and landing when their speed advantage disappeared. 56th Fighter Group pilots learned to loiter near German jet bases, waiting for the moment when an Me-262 had to slow down. Across all P-47 units and variants, American pilots claimed approximately 20 Me-262s and 4 Arado 234s, proving that even jets were not immune to a well-flown propeller fighter. The P-47N, designed specifically for the long-range Pacific campaign, featured an enlarged wet wing that increased fuel capacity and range dramatically. Its wingspan grew to 42 feet 7 inches, and its R-28057C or R-28077 engine gave it performance nearly matching the M model. 1,816 N models were built before the Japanese surrender, and they saw extensive action in the final campaigns against Japan. The ability to escort B-29 superfortresses on their longest missions made the P-47N invaluable in the closing months of the Pacific War. The R-2800 double Wasp engine that powered the Thunderbolt became one of the most produced aircraft engines in history. Pratt and Whitney and their licensees built 125,334 examples between 1939 and 1960. The engine proved so reliable and powerful that it continued in production long after the war ended, finding applications in everything from airliners to cargo planes to agricultural aircraft. Beyond the Thunderbolt, the R-2800 powered some of the most famous aircraft of the Second World War. The F-6F Hellcat, which destroyed more Japanese aircraft than any other Allied fighter, relied on the double Wasp for its impressive performance. The F-4U Corsair, with its distinctive bent wings, used the same engine to become one of the most effective naval fighters ever built. The B-26 Marauder medium bomber carried two R-2800s and delivered devastating attacks throughout the European and Pacific theatres. This single-engine family contributed more to Allied victory than perhaps any other mechanical component of the war. By VE Day in May of 1945, P-47s had flown approximately 545,000 combat sorties in all theatres. The official records credited Thunderbolt pilots with destroying approximately 3,700 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat, with thousands more destroyed during strafing attacks on airfields. In the European theatre alone, combined air and ground kills exceeded 7,000 enemy aircraft. The Thunderbolt also destroyed more than 9,000 locomotives, crippling German logistics. Its pilots dropped over 132,000 tons of bombs on enemy targets. The air-to-air kill ratio stood at an impressive 4.6 to 1. These statistics, impressive as they are, do not fully capture what the Thunderbolt meant to the men who flew it. For pilots like Robert Johnson, the P-47 was more than a weapon. It was a partner that had saved his life in circumstances that should have been fatal. For Gabreski and Zemke and Kiabi and thousands of others whose names history has not remembered, it was the instrument through which they demonstrated their skill and courage. The ground crews who kept the Thunderbolts flying deserve equal recognition. These mechanics worked around the clock in freezing English winters and sweltering Pacific summers to keep the big fighters airworthy. They changed engines and patched holes and replaced shot-up control surfaces. They treated each aircraft as if their own lives depended on its reliability, because in a very real sense, the lives of their pilots did. For the Germans, the Thunderbolt represented something more troubling than just another enemy weapon. It was proof that they had fundamentally miscalculated. They had looked at the massive, seemingly ungainly American fighter and seen its weaknesses. They had developed tactics to exploit those weaknesses. They had congratulated themselves on understanding their enemy, and then a wider propeller blade had rendered their expertise worthless. This pattern repeated itself across the war. German engineering was often superior in individual components. Their jets were revolutionary. Their tanks were formidable in single combat. Their submarines incorporated innovations that Allied navies struggled to counter. But they consistently underestimated the ability of their enemies, particularly the Americans, to solve problems through practical innovation and overwhelming production. The P-47's paddle blade propeller was not a breakthrough of the sort that German engineers would have celebrated. It was not elegant or revolutionary. No one would write doctoral dissertations about it. It was simply effective. Someone had looked at a problem, wider blades would transfer more power, and implemented a solution. The result was an aircraft transformed. Alexander Kartveli, the Georgian immigrant who had designed the Thunderbolt, continued to work on advanced aircraft after the war. His next project, the F-84 Thunderjet, would serve extensively in Korea. Later still, he would lead the design of the F-105 Thunderchief, which would bear the heaviest burden of the air campaign against North Vietnam. In each case, Kartveli favoured the same approach that had defined the P-47. He built rugged, powerful aircraft that could absorb punishment and deliver devastating firepower. He remembered his first war, remembered the value of bringing pilots home alive, and designed accordingly. Republic Aviation lost its independence when it was acquired by Fairchild Hiller on September 30th, 1965. It continued operating as the Republic Aviation Division and later Fairchild Republic until 1987, when Fairchild finally shuttered the Farmingdale facility. The building still stands, repurposed for other uses, a monument to the workers who built the fighters that helped win the war. The Thunderbolts themselves endured far longer. After the war, surplus P-47s were supplied to air forces around the world. They served with the reconstituted air forces of France and Italy. They flew in South America and Asia. Some continued in frontline service into the 1960s, their rugged construction proving as valuable in peacetime as it had been in war. Today, approximately 15 flyable P-47s remain, though the number fluctuates as aircraft enter and exit restoration. These aircraft are cherished by collectors and warbird organizations who spend fortunes maintaining them in airworthy condition. When they appear at air shows, crowds gather to watch them taxi past, marveling at their massive size and listening to the distinctive thunder of their R2800 engines. That sound, a combination of power and mechanical complexity, is unlike anything produced by modern turbojets. It is the sound of a different era, when machines were built to last and pilots flew by skill and instinct rather than computer assistance. The paddle blade propeller modification that transformed the Thunderbolt's combat capability seems almost laughably simple in retrospect. Making the blades wider was not the kind of innovation that wins engineering prizes. It was the kind of practical solution that emerges when smart people focus relentlessly on solving a specific problem. The Germans had their V-2 rockets, and their jet fighters, and their wonder weapons. The Americans had wider propeller blades, and factories that could build aircraft faster than the enemy could shoot them down. In the end, that was the lesson Germany failed to learn until it was too late. War is not won by those with the most impressive technology or the most sophisticated designs. It is won by those who can most effectively translate available resources into combat power. The P-47 Thunderbolt, ungainly as it sometimes appeared, was a perfect expression of that principle. For the German pilots who had once dismissed the Thunderbolt as a sluggish target, there was no comfort in their final months of the war. The aircraft they had mocked now climbed with deadly purpose. The tactics that had kept them alive were now getting them killed, and somewhere in America, factories were turning out these improved fighters faster than anyone could count. The paddle blade Thunderbolt was not just a weapon, it was a statement about what happens when practical engineering meets industrial capacity. It declared that solutions need not be elegant to be effective, that production trumps perfection, and that the nation the Reich had dismissed as soft and decadent was perfectly capable of building the most effective air force the world had ever seen. That statement was written in the skies over Europe in 1944 and 45. It was written by men named Johnson and Gabreski and Zemke, by thousands of pilots whose names never made the history books, and by the ground crews and factory workers who kept the Thunderbolts flying. It was written in the wreckage of German aircraft scattered across France and Germany, and in the terror that gripped German soldiers whenever they heard the distinctive sound of an R2800 at full power. And it began with a simple question: what if we made the propeller blades wider? That question, and the answer that followed, changed the course of aerial combat over Europe. It transformed a good fighter into a great one. It gave American pilots the edge they needed at the moment they needed it most. And it proved, once again, that in war, the most important innovations are often the simplest ones. The Germans never expected a wider propeller to transform their predictable enemy into something they could not handle. They paid for that miscalculation in blood and burning aircraft, in lost pilots and shattered units, in the slow grinding defeat of an air force that had once dominated European skies. The paddle-blade P-47 wrote its legacy in the only language that ultimately mattered, the language of victory.